I recently spoke for the Friendship Circle. They had an event for parents. It was supposed to be educational, to provide parents with some kind of instruction or counsel or guidance about how to live with children with special needs. The Friendship Circle happens to be my nephew. It's kind of hard to tell him no. So I agreed to speak for Friendship Circle. And then, of course, the question became, what am I going to tell him? How are you going to tell parents who are in a chronically difficult situation advice that should be meaningful and should resonate and so on? No one's interested in speeches. People want to hear things that are relevant and that are real. So I spoke to them about an experience that my wife and I had. We had a child many, many years ago that passed away, and I Pashat shared our personal experiences with them, because if I would have said anything other than that, I would have been a bluffer and a liar. Because parents who are going through a challenge, a difficulty, don't want to hear some expert come and tell them how they should deal with their challenges. They're the experts. So here I am sitting in a room full of mechanchim, telling mechanchim how to be mechanchim, which is interesting, to put it mildly. You certainly don't want to hear from me things you already know. It's an old adage, never tell people things they already know. Because if somebody already knows something, either they're doing it or not interested in doing it, and you telling it to them is not going to make a change. So I'm going to try my best to be forthright, to say things as they are, at least the way I understand them. I really hope, that my remarks will be relevant and useful and maybe even inspiring. My topic is the Rebbe's view on Chinuch, Chassidishe Chinuch. What's the definition of a Chassidishe Chinuch? So before we get to Chassidishe Chinuch, we must talk about Chinuch in general. Before you talk about what's unique about a Chinuch associated with Chassidim and a Chassidishe community and Chassidishe children, you have to first define what Chinuch is on a basic level. And of course, Chinuch on a basic level is not even limited to Jewish children. Chinuch on a basic level has to do with human beings, how you rear, how you educate, how you raise human beings, children. And of course, over the years, the Rebbe has had so much to say about Chinuch. Number one, the Rebbe once told an educator years ago that Chinuch is like going hunting. When somebody hunts, they're trying to shoot a prey animal. And usually prey animals, especially if they're aware that they're being hunted, are moving. So if you shoot your arrow or your bullet where the animal is at the time that you shoot, by the time the arrow or the bullet reaches where the animal was, the animal is no longer there. And therefore, effective hunting is to anticipate where the animal is going to be when the arrow reaches where the animal is. So you cannot shoot for where the animal is at that point. You have to shoot to where the animal will be when the arrow reaches. And of course, this is really the million-dollar question when it comes to Chinuch, and the million-dollar measure when it comes to Chinuch. Children go through school. The real measure of success or failure in Chinuch isn't the way they behave in school, isn't the way they behave in the classroom or in the streets or in their homes. It's what happens to them when they're adults. If children grow up and they're difficult in school, and when they finish school, they're mentioned, they were educated in school. It's not a miracle that they turned out to be mentioned. On the other hand, if children are suppressed and they behave in school, and when they leave school, you don't see the influence, the effect of the Chinuch on the child, that's failure, that's not success. Because Chinuch is not about how the children look at the time they're in school. Chinuch is about how the children are going to look when they're grown up, when they're done with school. And of course, most importantly, the Rebbe repeated again and again and again, hundreds of times, particularly when he was on television, on cable TV, and he was being watched by the whole world, including, of course, many, many non-Jews, the Rebbe would say this repeatedly, that education is not teaching children mathematics and chemistry, physics, biology. In other words, education is not about preparing children to make a living. It's one of the great, great tragedies of the modern time, of the modern world, where that's how people perceive chinuch, that's how parents define what their education of their children is going to be, how they're going to make a living. And it's literally tragic. Chinuch is about raising human beings. And human beings are about honesty, human beings are about kindness, human beings are about loyalty, human beings are about responsibility, human beings are about compromise, human beings are knowing how to lose. And that's what education is supposed to be. And when a child goes to school, educators, ideally, in truth, in principle, naturally they're stimulating, they're filling the minds of the children that they're educating, but the spirit and the framework of the school and the classroom and a considerable amount of time and effort has to be invested so that you're teaching children how to be human beings. And one of the great tragedies that the Rebbe would lament about the separation of church and state in America is that it's become almost impossible for a teacher, even if they so desire, to teach any kind of morality, ethics to children, because you're mixing in religion. And because of this, kids go to school, they learn a bunch of stuff, and they're literally uneducated. Wilde gras, they're really learning nothing of substance in school. There's a little quote that everybody has seen, I'm sure, 100 times. Everything I really needed to learn, I learned in kindergarten. Like how to share and how to say please, and how to clean up after yourself, and so on and so forth. When you're in kindergarten, those lessons are in a kindergarten level. And when you're in elementary school, and in junior high school, and in Mesivta, these things take on a different form, but they're just as much, or more perhaps, a part of the definition of chinuch. And if a child goes to school and doesn't learn how to be a human being, how to be a mensch, so from a perspective of how we define the word chinuch, it's a failure, it's bankruptcy. It doesn't matter how much money that child is going to make. Number 3, when you send the child to school, the child is supposed to work. All of us know, or we should know, that school for children is equal to work for adults. Children have parents, they get up in the morning, they go to work. Children get up in the morning and they go to school. That's their job, that's their responsibility. Now, of course, what happens in a school with children and the way they do their work is quite different than parents going to school and going to work, doing their job. But school for a child is an obligation. Children have to go to school. It's not a voluntary thing. Children have to go to school. And what they do in school is work. They write, they read, they think, they're challenged. Some children are very good at it, so they love it. Other children are not so good at it, so they resent it, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is what happens when you send the child to school. They have to work. And there is a huge question when it comes to educating children, particularly when it comes to the specific area of work. If you want your child to be a mensch, you have to push him. You want your child to be a somebody, I'm sorry for using that terminology, you have to squeeze him. There's an unbelievable story with the Frierdiker Rebbe. That when the Frierdiker Rebbe was young, I don't know how old he was, but he may have been before Bar Mitzvah. When the Frierdiker Rebbe was young, the Rebbe, his mother, walked into the cheder, the office of the Rebbe Nishmas Seiden, the Rebbe Rashab. It was a large room, and there was some kind of a sofa or a couch in the Rebbe Nishmas Seiden's cheder. The Rebbe Rashab was sitting at his desk, doing his work. The Frierdiker Rebbe was standing next to this couch, holding his head with both of his hands, staggering, like he's going to fall. So the Rebbetzin turns to the Rebbe and says, "Was ist das? What's this?" So the Rebbe Rashab says to the Rebbetzin Shtene Soda in Yiddish, "I told him to concentrate on an inyan until he collapses." He should concentrate with his mind on a sugya, on an inyan, until he physically falls down. How many hours could the Rebbe Rayatz concentrate? 20 hours. How long can we concentrate for? 5 minutes? 2 seconds, yeah? The Rebbe Rayatz must have been standing there for hours. And the Rebbe Sishtan says to her husband, the Rebbe, this is cruel. It's achzorius. And the Rebbe Rashab says to the Rebbe, "Was für ein Sohn willst du? What kind of son do you want?" And this is a very serious component in education. Kids have to work and kids have to be pushed. Kids have to be pushed. So how much are you going to push your child? How much is right and how much is wrong? And it's a very, very, very sensitive question. The philosophy of the time in which we live, which worships the idol of self-esteem, is very, very sensitive to chas v'sholem, hurt a child's feelings or anything like this. And it's very unfortunate because the end result is that kids don't work. Kids don't work. And a very significant part of education is to push children and make children work. Yes, you can overpush. It's happened many times. But we can also tragically underpush. And when you underpush, you undereducate, you underteach, you underdevelop, which is tragic and unfortunate. Number 4, the Gemara that everybody knows. Yetze tinik v'isha la'olam yehei smoil doiche v'yamin makareves. When it comes to the Yetzer Hara, which means everything towards which we are vulnerable and weak, when it comes to children, and when it comes to a spouse, to the person of the world we're closest to, the Gemara says, la'olam yehei smoil doiche v'yamin makareves. Smoil means boundaries, rules, borders, distance. In these relationships, there first needs to be smoil doiche. There needs to be boundaries to the relationship, and then can there be a min makareves, can there be an embracing, there can be an involvement between, in this case, a teacher and a student. The Rebbe has a wonderful sicha on this Gemara. I think it's a Pesach sicha, where the Rebbe talks about the Milsa de B'dicha, which is before education. A teacher cannot begin his relationship with the students with gvura because that means they have no relationship. But in terms of the relationship, there has to be smoil doichev yamin makareves, which means practically that as a teacher, and we're talking about education, it is incredibly important that you establish initially respect for yourself. Your job is not that your students should love you. Your job is they should be able to teach those students. And you can't teach those students unless they understand that you're their teacher, which means you're not their buddy, you're not their equal. They're not doing you a favor by listening to you. They have to listen to you. You're the teacher and they're the students. And that doesn't happen unless you walk into the classroom and establish parameters, rules. You don't necessarily have to say them with words. You can say them with body language. You can say them with a certain sense of self, a certain presentation of self that says, I'm the teacher of the students. And the same is true with parents and children. We're not buddies. We're not equals. And any effort to be makarev students that involves the idea that I'm going to be so nice and so friendly, they're all going to love me, is a tragic mistake. It's doomed to failure. It never works. And above all else, that's not education. That's not chinuch. Chinuch is not getting the kids to listen to me. Chinuch is getting the kids to learn from me. And the kids will learn from me if I respect myself. And that respect of self involves a distance between a teacher and students. Number 5. The greatest aspect of chinuch is children learn by example. Children learn from what they see. They learn from what they see in their homes. They learn from what they see in their teacher, in the world of their teachers. And of course, hypocrisy is really unforgivable when it comes to chinuch. When someone's a hypocrite when it comes to chinuch, when a person acts a certain way in the classroom and in fact is a different human being, the students know it. And the students are not learning from the example they see in the classroom. because they know that that's the act. The students are learning who the person really is. In other words, if a person is a mechanech, what they're giving their students is themselves. It's not the hours they're in the classroom, it's not the information they're imparting, it's the life they lead. And this is 1,000-fold more true when it comes to parents. I have one of these stories. It's a true story. I have a cousin, older than I am, who got married and spoke to their children in Yiddish. It's a very, very popular thing. You teach your children in Yiddish. But he and her spoke in English. So they're talking to the children in Yiddish, and they're talking to one another in English, and the child turns 5 or 6 and refuses to talk Yiddish, talking English. So the mother says to the little boy, why are you talking in Yiddish? If Avos says to English, does it in Yiddish? So he says, Mommy, Yiddish is a baby sprach. Who are we kidding? And now I'm grown up, now I'm like you. You talk English, I talk English. This happened b'poil. It's an incredible window into what's happening in the mind of a child. When we are educators, the children learn not just what we teach them and what we tell them, but from who we are. And of course, one of the aspects of that, particularly as parents, but also to some degree as teachers, is what do we do during our leisure time? What do we do when we have downtime? The kids are watching. Well, how do we relax? How do we unwind? And what we do during the time that we're unwinding, whether in the teacher's room or in our living room or in our bedroom, is going to impact, is going to teach the children what they should do and what's important, because what adults do is adult. And if it's adult, then it's got to be very important, very meaningful, very correct. And of course, lastly, when it comes to chinuch, and this is the million-dollar question of our era, unfortunately, is children need to be entertained. Children need to be entertained. Children need to be kept busy and entertained. I have a friend who always tells me the greatest thing that can happen to a child is he should be bored, because that's where creativity is. But in our civilization, if a child is bored, it's a terrible, terrible thing, so we have to keep the child busy. Children have to be entertained. And when it comes to entertaining children, how do you entertain your children? So what kind of entertainment is appropriate, is good? What kind of entertainment is benign, that means positive? And what kind of entertainment is bad? Pashut bad. And this is true in the home, and it's true in the classroom. It's very, very true in the classroom, because in the classroom also there's entertainment moments. And these are, the answer to this question, which I'm not going to give, is unbelievably serious, unbelievably important, and it has to be thought through. What the kids do when they have fun. In the olden days, they used to say, children learn through play. Ask any child psychologist. Children learn through play. When children play, they're learning things. But when they're very little. Because when children are very little and they play, you're not creating their games. They're creating their games. And at a certain point, and in our civilization, in our society, it's earlier and earlier and earlier, we're giving them the tools. We're telling them what's fun. We're giving them the toys, rather than allowing them to create for themselves what they're going to do for entertainment. At that point, playing is no longer education. It's empty time. It's empty time. But in empty time, there's good, there's positive, and there's bad. Now, the list I just read, I think it's 6 points, has nothing to do with Chassidishe chinuch, nothing. It doesn't even have to do with Yiddish chinuch. It has to do with human beings. Parents raise children, they want something from their children. They want their children to be mentioned. And I don't mean mention in the cultural sense that people should say they have good manners. Mention in the true sense. You're not allowed to tell a lie. You're not allowed to steal, you're not allowed to cheat, you're not allowed to hurt. You're not allowed to be disloyal. Those are real values. And adults are supposed to have those values, and you have to teach those values to children. That's chinuch. And yes, a very important part of chinuch is pushing hard work. Children who don't work are going to be crippled adults. We know this from ourselves in some cases. So what is Chassidishe chinuch? I mean, perhaps I should have a middle step. What is Yiddish chinuch? But what I shared until now is universal. This applies to a non-Jew raising his or her child. What's the Chassidishe chinuch? So if I needed to find a most concise, as few words as possible to articulate what the Chassidishe Chinuch is, the first word I would use is fire. And the second word I would use is honey. What's the fire? So we all know the story. We all know the story. But it's not stam as a sipur, was mit erzählt, was a schöne Meise. It's a lebendige Meise. It's a story that really touches all of us as human beings and as parents and as mechanchim. That the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, was 9. And he was a Yosef. He was an orphan. He was raised by Baba Zayd. He was raised by his grandparents. His father was someplace else. He was raised by the Alter Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe's Rebbetzin. The Gehesen Harabonis HaSitkonis Sterne. And the Alter Rebbe had every Friday night Biyurei HaZohar, a Shir in Zohar. Today it's printed as my modern Biyurei HaZohar. The Tzemach Tzedek, as a 9-year-old, wanted very much to participate in this Shir. The Tzemach Tzedek, at the age of 9, could understand a Shir of the Alter Rebbe, a Maim of the Alter Rebbe on Zohar. And the Alter Rebbe told him he's too young. He went to it, bar mitzvah, whatever the age is, Alter Rebbe didn't let him in. And the Tzemach Tzedek insisted, and I think he even showed some emotion, and the Alter Rebbe stood his ground. The Alter Rebbe said, no, you're too young. So the Tzemach Tzedek was a smart little boy. They had an oven, a oven that heated with wood or with coals, that warmed 4 rooms at the same time. It was in the center of the house, and each room had a hearth, each room had a fireplace with a gate, with a rack. They would heat one oven and warm up 4 rooms. The Alter Rebbe was sitting in one cheder. The Tzemach Tzedek went to a different cheder, opened up the grate, crept from that side of the oven to the other side of the oven, and he was right behind the Alter Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe is like Chassidus, and Tzemach Tzedek is listening. It was a Friday night. It became cool in the house. So but Yerufin them goy, they got the goy to warm up the oven. The guy starts putting the wood into the oven, and there's no room because there's a boy inside. Nu hab seichel gib a cook, but he was impatient, so he put the twigs and the leaves with which he wanted to start the fire at the opening of the oven on the opposite side, and he lit it, and above them he put larger pieces of wood that should start a fire. And of course, when you first light a fire, there's a lot of smoke, and he's lighting the fire, and he's fanning the fire, and the fire is getting hotter and larger, and all of a sudden the entire fire is thrust out of the oven into the room, and they look inside the oven. Tzemach Tzedek is laying on the floor of the oven, out cold. So there became a hysteria. The Rebbetzin started screaming. The Tzemach Tzedek's Bubbe. The Alter Rebbe interrupted the Maimach Chassidus, and he came to see what happened. And his Rebbetzin, screamed at him. I think these are the words exactly. Shir, we almost had a tragedy. The Alter Rebbe went over to the Tzemach Tzedek, he put his hand on his head, and he opened his eyes. And the Rebbetzin screamed at him, and she said, "What kind of shagas? He wants to hear Chassidus, let him hear Chassidus. We almost had a tragedy." And the Alter Rebbe said, "Nay." The Alter Rebbe disagreed. And the Alter Rebbe said that the Torah is nit geworden mit sneh. We got the Torah after the sneh. Because the Torah is nikne dafka with eish. A person acquires the Torah with fire. And the Alter Rebbe said, "Muftachani as if et meirech yomim zayin." I'm in a state of trust, in a zicherkeit, I'll be meirech yomim. And the Alter Rebbe underscored the idea that this wasn't an accident. This is how a person is koine Torah mit eish, mit fire. And then, of course, there's the minig yisrael Torah, that when a child turns the age of Chinuch, when you make the child l'cheder, and there's a lot of questions of what that age is it upshedenis, is it before upshedenis, is it after upshedenis, but it's not part and parcel of the upshedenis. When you bring a child in l'cheder, there's a whole bunch of menhagei yisrael which are yedua by malamdim, by malamdim dedardiki, by alav beis malamdim. And of course, a significant part of that is that the children lick the oisius of the olive base with honey, and they say eat a special honey cake. It's all made to be very sweet. And of course, when you run into a child who doesn't like honey, you got a problem. And again, the principle is the same. A Chassidishe Chinuch is not about the information. It's not about the knowledge. A Chassidishe Chinuch is not even about the Midas Tevis. A Chassidishe Chinuch is not even about the idea of being a human being, being a mensch. A Chassidishe Chinuch is about the fire of godliness, and the sweetness, the pleasantness of godliness. And when our children are very young, we inspire that fire in them, and we impress that sweetness upon them. And when you look at little kids, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, in many cases, perhaps a majority of cases, you see that fire. And you see that sweetness. In other words, the child doesn't go to school and learn. But the neshama of the learning is not the learning itself. The neshama of the learning is the Eibishter. The neshama of the learning is a lakus. And you want that the child should get from his melamed, fire and honik, that the melamed should communicate to the child as he teaches him. Initially he's teaching him Aleph Beis, then he's teaching him Ivre, and then he's teaching him Chumash, and then he's teaching him Rashi, and then he's teaching him Mishnayos, and he's teaching him Gemara, then he's teaching him Chassidus. Whatever he's teaching him, the melamed is communicating to the child not just the data, not just the information, not just the words and the taich. The melamed is communicating to that child fire, and the melamed is communicating to that child the sweetness, the pleasantness of Torah. And all of us know the challenge. When the children are very little, it's easy. It's easy. It's very easy to give them that fire. It's very easy to give them that sweetness. And part of the reason it's easy when the children are very little, you can argue that part of the reason is because the children are naive. But part of the reason it's easy when the children are very little is because we spend so much time on it. A child in the very earliest years of his education does very little learning and a lot of other things. And the teacher, the moire or the moira, has so much time to dedicate to, what we would call in the Bacharimshe environment, Shimusha Shal Torah. This fire and this sweetness. The children are going to go on to the first grade, second grade, third grade, and then of course there's going to be obligations. You have to learn so much, you have to learn it so quickly, and you have to know it this way, and so on and so forth. And it becomes unbelievably difficult, or virtually impossible, to continue to communicate to the children the fire and the sweetness of Torah. It's a tragedy. It's really not, it's not right. Because if the children stop hearing what they heard in kindergarten and in first grade, when they learned Aleph Beis, the fire and the ziskeit von Torah is somehow replaced by something different, it's no longer a Chassidishe Chinuch. Chassidim, the Rabbeim, believed that the neshama is above all else, period. The neshama is above all else. And the neshama is emunah, the neshama is ahava, the neshama is yira, the neshama is not smarts, the neshama is not academics, the neshama is not scholarship, the neshama isn't scholastics, the neshama is godliness. And from the moment the Baal Shem Tov appeared on this earth, he created a derech hachayim that places so much premium on neshama that nothing is more important than nourishing and sustaining neshama. When they're little and when they're bigger, when they're even bigger when they're adults, this has to be a constant in the spirit of the chinuch that the children are hearing and getting and maintaining. Fire und Ziskeit, that in their minds and in their hearts, their lives are fire, brennen. And Aziz, because this is the Yiddishkeit that we're trying to teach them. I'll share a story with you. I heard this story from the Baal HaMaaseh. And I'm sharing this story to make a point. There's a Yid I know, Chanel Ma'emes, okay, so I knew him 30 years ago, who became frum through the intervention, through the hashpah of Rabbi Yosef Dave Soloveitchik. He lived in Boston, and Rabbi Soloveitchik lived in Boston. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva University. He was a Rav in a shul in Boston or whatever. He built a school called Maimonides. And this family became through his influence. And then they got involved in Lubavitch. And they became Lubavitcher. Rabbi Soloveitchik, as we know, had great respect for the Rebbe. And he liked Chassidim and Chassidus. But he disagreed. He basically disagreed. So this man told me that when his children came to Lubavitch, this is already embellishment. He wasn't happy. So he tells me that he was in a business office, and Rabbi Soloveitchik was coming out of an elevator, and he was about to step into the elevator, and Rabbi Soloveitchik grabbed him by the collar and said to him, "Promise me you'll send your children to college." In other words, promise me that Lubavitch won't ruin them totally. You know what I'm saying? Promise me you'll send your children to college. He couldn't make that promise. He couldn't. Why? Because it was no longer in his control. Even if he wanted, they were learning in the Chassidishe yeshiva. And Soloveitchik would not let go. You see, he was an action. He's a Soloveitchik. They're akshonim. I'm not going to say they're akshonim like Schneersons, but they're akshonim. And there was this impasse. He held on to the guy, and he says, "Let me go." Nope. And I don't know how long he stood, but it wasn't 5 minutes. He stood and he stood. Save kol save. Rabbi Soloveitchik was a Gadol B'Yisrael, a God Nadir. So he promised him. He says some of his kids didn't finish till they were 50, but he made them do it. He made a promise and he kept his words. There's a meaning to this story that's very, very important. He believed, Soloveitchik believed, that if you're going to be frum in America, you have to be intellectual. His idea was that Pashat Yidden don't stand a chance in America. If someone's not an intellectual, if someone is not mit Grace Yeda, wird nicht sein frum. Why? Because you have to be so smart to figure out how it makes sense in a modern world that you should keep Shabbos and kosher and mikveh and tefillin and so on. This was his philosophy, this was the Shita. When he created Teiro Mada, this was his idea. He believed and believes that if you're going to stay frum, you have to be so smart that you're smarter than the goy. You're so smart that part of your smarts is your Teiro mitzvahs. To say that the Rebbe disagrees is the greatest understatement of the century. There's no comparison whatsoever between how the Rebbe looks at Chinuch and how he looks at Chinuch. The Rebbe believed, as we say, the Lashon is Teira Tmima. There's no Teirim Derecheretz, there's no Teira Mada, there's Teira Tmima. Nahama Benama. Teira, you learn with Teira. Finished. Why? Because the philosophy is Chinuch al Taras HaKedesh. Chinuch al Taras HaKedesh. We give our children only fire and honey. We don't give them Elam Haza. And when I say we don't give them Elam Haza, I don't mean that we make believe there's no world. When I say we don't give our children Elam Haza, I mean it's not part of Chinuch. Children do things in this world all the time, but that's not education. It's something else. You know, a person needs to learn an umnus. He can be mefanes b'nebeise. A person has to learn a skill to mefanes b'nebeise. That's information that's going to serve a purpose. It's not who he is. He's a Yid. I met a Jew years ago who told me, it's a gewaltige Wort. He said to me, I went to medical school and I'm not a doctor. I say, what do you mean you went to medical school, I'm not a doctor? He says, I don't think being a doctor is a yichus. I think learning Daf HaYomi is a yichus. This is what he told me, okay? I'm not propagandizing Daf HaYomi. I did that already, yeah? I don't think that's not what I am. I am a Yid. And when we're educating our children, it's very important that our kavanah has to reflect. We have to know that what's important to us is fire and honey. Our children have to understand and have to sense that it's important to us as fire and honey. And it's never allowed to be echad b'peh v'echad b'lev. I say one thing and I mean something else. The children have to appreciate that what the parents are giving and what the parents want the children to receive as chinuch, and the type of chinuch is what's going to make them into a mensch, what's going to make them into a human being, is Yiddishkeit. And not only the knowledge of Yiddishkeit and the practical performance of the mitzvahs, but the fire and the honey. This is Chassidishe chinuch in a nutshell, in a capsule, in a few minutes. Chassidishe chinuch from the times that the Baal Shem Tov been Chassidishe Melamdim gave their children fire and honey. And if they were successful Chassidishe Melamdim, the kids didn't lose it when they were 7. They didn't become skeptical. They retained it till before Bar Mitzvah and during Bar Mitzvah and after Bar Mitzvah. This is one of the challenges we face. We're very good at giving it to very little kids. And in a very short time, it becomes more and more difficult. What the reasons are is not for now, and what the solutions are, I don't know. But this is what Chassidishe chinuch is. We're giving them neshama. Because chinuch is about neshama, because that's the truth of what the person is. Having said that, I have 13 more minutes, like my cheshbon. There's a practical reality to chinuch. And the practical reality to chinuch is some of the children get hundreds, and some of the children get 65s or 50s, whatever failing is today. You have better children, you have worse children. You have children who do incredibly well, you have children who do very poorly, you have children in the middle. And of course, a chinuch model really has to reach all of them. Not all of them that they're all 100. All of them that none of them are failures, that there's no bankrupt, we don't lose them. And this, of course, is the $1 million challenge. You sit in a classroom, you have such a cross-section of children, I don't need to tell you this. You have the kids who are a pleasure. If you had a classroom full of such people, the Rebbe once told them, listen, for Chassidische Bachim darf man nicht. Who needs you? We need you for the troublemakers. Reb Nissen couldn't relate to that. It was all about Chassidishe Bachim. And the challenges of chinuch is to reach the maximum number of children. And again, we're not making them all perfect, but we have to reach all of them. And as a consequence of this, we have a reality. And I'm going to use words. That's all I can do is use words. I believe that what I'm sharing is credible and true. In other words, I'm not trying to sell you anything. I think that this is the emes. And if I'm wrong, then the Eibush has to forgive me. There is a balance between the fire and the honey on the one hand and the learning on the other hand. If a kid goes to school and he gets the fire and the honey, and he comes out of yeshiva, he's 20, he's 21, he's 22, he's 23, and a kenish leinen. Can't read. He's very chassidish, very vadim. And he can't learn. He didn't learn anything in 15 years in school. Why? There's a lot of answers. So there is a percentage of children that doesn't make a difference, doesn't matter. There's so much fire and there's so much honey, they'll live their life with this fire and their honey. How are they going to make a living? The same way we all make a living. The Eibush is going to provide. But there's a significant percentage of children for whom that does not work. A very significant percentage of children for whom does not work. We all know this. That if kids go to school and they waste their time, and I mean academically now, I don't mean they're wasting their time, that they're not enjoying the fire and the honey. I mean they're not learning. And of course, the way learning works, in the first grade, I remember being a little kid. I was in the first grade, I got olive pluses on everything. I was so good. I had such good marks, I didn't even bother to check that every other kid in my class also had straight olive pluses. And I remember the first time I got an olive. I was either in second grade or third grade. I was so insulted. How do you not give me an olive plus? And then my first olive minus? Are you kidding me? And then when I got a Bays minus, and then when I got a fail, the malamed de right? When the children are very, very little, the disparity, the distance between the better ones and the worst ones is very small. And as they grow, it stretches. And unfortunately, a lot of children get lost. They get lost. By the time children are learning Mishnayos and even Chumash, They're no longer keeping up academically. They cannot nicht lernen. They can't read. They can't translate. They don't understand the words. They don't understand the ideas. And they certainly aren't enjoying it. And when you teach a kid to read and translate words, that's memorization. When you teach a child to read and translate words and understand the concept, Havana, that's delightful. That's fun. That's exciting if he understands. And if he doesn't understand, or if it doesn't reach him, it doesn't mean anything to him, it's tragic. It's very, very, very frustrating. You have, by the time, I teach in Zal, I teach big Bachrim. These kids who can't read, they're academically third grade level. It's a tragedy. How such a thing happens, and it's not one or two, I don't know. But it's terrible. And it's not only terrible because they can't learn. It's terrible because they're resentful. In other words, in plain English, it's true that a Chassidishe Chinuch is about fire and honey. But at what point is a child's ability to learn, connected to his Shmidas Shabbos Kipshutei? At what point is a child going through school and failing a very direct cause for what they call today OTD, off the derech? As much as a Chassidishe Chinuch is about Chassidishe values, isn't it true that our purpose is that the kids should grow up from? Now, why do kids not grow up from? There's 1,000 reasons. And if I had more than the 8 minutes left that I have pages and pages of the stuff that I could share. There's a lot of reasons why, but there's no question that one of them is that they learn nothing in school, and it has nothing to do with parnasa. Nothing to do with parnasa. It's an excuse, it's a lie. It has to do with the fact that they didn't develop their minds. A kid who goes through our system and doesn't learn a word of English, but develops his mind, is 1,000,000 miles ahead of a person who went limudei chol. And I'm not saying it because it's propaganda. I'm saying it because it's a fact of life. Look around the world. Look what Lubavitch has achieved. A bunch of Olatedeniks. Moshe Chaim. Yeah, there's nobody more Olated than Chaim. Spoke at the Kinnis HaShluchim, was the keynote speaker. His English was impeccable. When he went on Shlichus, he didn't know the ABC. Never then, he learned Torah, and you learn how to think and how to reason. You have to learn a skill, you learn a skill. But if kids sit in school and don't learn, and there is a significant percentage of children who are not learning from an early age, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade. By the time they're in 8th grade, there's nobody home. And of course, and there's plenty in the Choshen V'Akrabim. And what do? They sit there. The Gemara says, right? As a mensch leiro, simen teve Talmud 5 shonim, shuv lo yire, was sagt die Gemara, yeshiv yishamesh et chaveru b'yeshiva. But at what cost? In other words, there comes a point where helping a child learn, understand the shtikele Gemara, helping him push it, translate words, is not negeya in his being a Talmud Chochem. It's negeya in his keeping Shabbos when he's an adult. And this is a challenge to us. The way I see it, the way I understand it, is as a pendulum. You know, Lubavitch, like every other community, has a pendulum. There are times, this happened in the history of Lubavitch here in America, that Bachrim haben sich gekocht zu viele Nigle. Could you imagine that? There was a time in 770 that the Bachrim gelernt, the gekocht has sehr viel Nigle, and the Mashpiyim are going to say, Chassidus matei aleha. It actually happened. They haben gehabt a Geschmack in Lenin, gesessen und gelernt, and then of course you have to light a fire and you have to make them appreciate Morsha B'Teira. And then there are times that we're so busy with the honey and the fire, and the kids are not working, and the kids are not developing themselves, and it's no longer a question of learning a page of Gemara and knowing something. It's simply a question of them being frum when they grow up. And I think that as far as Chassidishe Chinuch goes, this becomes a part of Chassidus. It becomes a part of Chassidus at a certain point that the children have to like themselves in school. And I'm not a self-esteem fanatic. They have to push it, value what they're doing. You know, I'm going to tell you something. This is not nice. I shouldn't say it, but I'm going to say it anyway. What? Okay, I hope I don't get in too much trouble. What's the biggest difference between our girls and our boys? What's the biggest difference between our girls and our boys? This is my own opinion. Nobody has to agree with me. Just wait with the eggs till I'm finished, okay? What's the biggest difference in our girls and our boys? I'll tell you what I think it is. The girls write. They write. They put pen to paper. They write. They're constantly writing. They're certainly writing in Limudei Chol, and to a great extent they're writing in Limudei Kodesh. The boys don't write. I remember my daughters went to school. I was a boy. I was never a girl. Never went to Beis Rivka. My children were growing up. So I had daughters. I learned how they educate a girl. They had a class in Beis Rivka that was called journal. What is journal? Sit for half an hour and write. Whatever you want. Whatever you want. The kids sat in class once a week or twice and wrote. Nobody marked them for penmanship. Nobody marked them for spelling. Nobody marked them for punctuation. They marked them for sitting and writing. So what do you think the kids wrote? So you had Nudnikis who wrote Shtusim V'Avolim, who doodled. But you had a considerable number of students who wrote. What do they write? What's in their mind, what they're thinking, a story, a fantasy, a Baba Mice matters, doesn't matter what. What happens to a child when he writes? I know what happened to me when I was a teenager. I wrote Nachanan. You learn how to think. Writing is not just writing, it's focusing. Our children need to learn. Because at a certain point, the fact that there's a percentage of our kids who are really totally lost to the limud aspect of the chinuch that we're giving them bankrupts it. Bankrupts it because it's no longer a question of Ken and Lenin. They resent everything. And at that point, that the child should learn this negaya, push it in his Yiddishkeit. Now, I have to be honest. I have 3 minutes left, and I haven't even started my talk. I really have so much more to say about a Chassidishe Chinuch, so I'm going to daven a bisele. Okay, I'm just going to go through quickly points, and I'm sorry that I gave so much time to the preliminaries and I didn't really get to the Nakuda, which is what happens now. I have a list of 5 points or 4 points that are very, very central to Chassidishe Chinuch from the perspective of the Rebbe that must be underscored. The first is represented by the model of Tzivos Hashem. The Rebbe made Tzivos Hashem. The Rebbe had a certain idea when he made Tzivos Hashem. We know the idea that the Rebbe had when he made Tzivos Hashem from a letter, a very, very famous letter to a professor, to an academic who was also a principal of a school, a psychologist, a mental health professional who was a principal of a school, who wrote to the Rebbe protesting, objecting to the word army. Army of Hashem conjures up violence. You're encouraging the children to be violent, and he told the Rebbe that the Rebbe should cancel it. And the Rebbe wrote him a 4-page letter. The Rebbe is available, and if you can't find the letter, you come to me, I'll give it to you. I'll help you get it. And the teichen of that letter is that the Rebbe said that he's looking at what's going on in America. And what he's learned is that, I'm using now my own English words, there's absolutely no respect in our society. What is the meaning of the word respect? The meaning of the word respect is that some things are right and some things are wrong, even if you're not going to be punished for not doing it, and you're not going to be rewarded for yes doing it. They're just right. An older person is walking, and you're walking, you let him go first. Menschlichkeit, basic Menschlichkeit. It has to do with civility, it has to do with Menschlichkeit. And the Rebbe says, I'm living in a society and I'm watching all this vanish. There's no respect in the civilization. There's no moral, there's no sense of right and wrong. The only reason the person doesn't steal is because he doesn't want to go to jail. And the Rebbe is afraid of the policeman. And then the Rebbe says, today there's no reason to fear the policeman because the judges are so liberal, the policeman is afraid to arrest you for a crime that you commit. So the end result is that you have a civilization that's growing up where people have no inner sense of a civilization. You know the old expression, locks are made for honest people. A civilization cannot survive on policemen. Civilizations survive on people being right because it's right. And the Rebbe says, I look at the America which I'm living and that's disappearing. It's disappearing. And the Rebbe said, I thought long and hard. The Rebbe should say, I thought long and hard about this question. And I concluded that if our civilization has a future, children have to be taught Kabbalah Sel. The Rebbe uses the Hebrew. The meaning of the words Kabbalah Sel is that somebody older than you tells you to do something, and that's the reason you do it, period. Your superior tells you to do something, and you do it just because they said. There's no why. And the Rebbe said, the only model I found in the entire society where you have a system that people are in a position of authority. In the Sichas, the Rebbe used to use the terminology, a commander-in-chief. But whatever level of superior officer one is, when the subordinate gets an order, he does what he's told, period. And the Rebbe's model, Rebbe's concept of Tzivos Hashem is that the commander-in-chief gives a Hera and the children follow, period. That's the end of it. This was the Rebbe's idea of Tzivos Hashem. The Rebbe's vision of Tzivos Hashem was to create a framework where children join, b'ritzeina mateiv, by their own free will, and do what they're told, just because they're told. And the point is, they should get into the habit of doing without asking why. Now, the Rebbe didn't make Tzivos Hashem for Chassidishe kids. He made it for Yiddische Kinder. But it's certainly a value of Chassidische Kinder. Value number one in a Chassidische Chinuch is Kabbalah Sale. I don't mean Kabbalah Sale, do what I say or I'm going to smash your head. Kabbalah Sale doesn't mean I'm making you do something against your will. You know, there's a big confusion between the word Kabbalah Sale and Hatola Sale. When I force you to do something, you didn't have Kabbalah Sale. I was Matil Oil. Kabbalah says that you accept from a superior and a command. In an army, when a subordinate listens to a superior, he doesn't resent it. He's not insulted. That's his job. When you tell a child to do and he listens because you're older than him, he doesn't resent it. That's his job. This is the Rebbe's idea of Tzivos Hashem, to teach children. When somebody else you told you to do something, the right thing to do is to listen. And you do it because you want to. And I'm not saying you love it. But the idea that I'm being forced, which is how Kabbalah Sale is. You listen to the kids. Kabbalah Sale to children means I'm a prisoner. Kabbalah Sale is not I'm a prisoner. Kabbalah Sale, and it's part of Chinuch, to impress upon children this idea that the adult tells them and they listen. It's good enough. It's correct. That's number one. Number two, and again, I'm supposed to finish. Number two, and this I think is critically important, to teach children halachas hatzirichas. And again, I'm going back to my own childhood. I was a little kid, and from Purim, you were preparing for Pesach. And the whole Elul, you were learning about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot. And at a certain point, it basically stops. I don't know what the age is, 4th grade, 5th grade. It basically stops. It's not my time, and it's not my job, it's not my place to criticize. How this has to be resolved, I don't know. But every child, every day, has to be taught how to do Yiddishkeit, not how to understand it, how to do it. Not just when they're in the 2nd grade, when they're 7th grade, 8th grade, and the 9th grade, and the 10th grade, they're a very significant part of the daily involvement with children as mechanchem is to show them bepoil how to do mitzvahs. And when the kids get a little older, you can have a discussion about it. You can bring a sefer in, you can argue about minhagim. But it's never allowed to stop. It's never supposed to come to a point where the kids already know what to do and we no longer tell them. This has to be a constant, because one of the definitions of Chassidus is lifnim yishuras hadin. And that's what lifnim yishuras hadin is, an oiskihit and a mitzvah maisis. Children have to always hear about gebraks, not just when they're in the 3rd grade. Children have to always hear about the shiurim for a matzah. It has to be a part of what's going on in school on a regular basis. And the same is true with such things from which we suffer, like where you stand in davening, and where you sit in davening, where you're allowed to speak and where you're not allowed to speak. This has to be regular. It has to be a constant diet. The kids have to, they can't learn the same thing over and over again. You'll bore them. But there always needs to be, as a part of a Chassidishe chinuch, children have to constantly be taught how to do mitzvahs ma'asiyos. And of course, when they're younger, it's on a simpler level. When they're older, it's on a more complex level. The day we don't include that, and what we're giving our children, we're making a very big mistake. If we're trying to give our children a Chassidishe chinuch. Okay, I'll say one more point and then I'll stop. One more point and I'll stop. All of us know the Sikh of the Rebbe. There are more Sikhs on this story than anything else in all of the Kutta Sikhs. I think there's 5. The story with the Rebbe Rashab. And the Rebbe Rashab was either 4, every Chanech knows this story, I've heard it 1,000 times. The Rebbe Rashab was 4 or 5 years old, and he went into the Tzemach Tzedek and he cried. Tzemach Tzedek asked him why he's crying. So he said, "Favos hat sich der Eibishter bewiesen zu Avraham Avinu, und zu mir beweist sich nicht." Why did Hashem show himself to Avraham Avinu and he doesn't show himself to me? And the Tzemach Tzedek answered him, Kiyudua. The Rebbe made a whole shturim out of the kasha. Not out of the teretz. The teretz also, but the kasha. Why do we have to hear a story about a Rebbe talking to a Rebbe? What does my son and my daughter and even myself, I, have to do with a conversation between a Rebbe and a Rebbe? And the Rebbe says the fact that the story was told and it reached us means it has a shaykhis to us. And there's a lot of pratim, many details to this, but the basic issue is the Rebbe is saying what this story teaches is children can do things altruistically. Children can do things l'shem shamayim. Children don't need, you don't have to bribe. Children don't need ulterior reasons to do things. You don't have to give a kid something so they should do it. There's a disease today called miftzas. And there are many Jews, without a miftzah, they don't put on tefillin. Everything has to be bribed, and the bribes are disproportionate. They're giving him huge prizes for relatively little work. It's all upside down. It's just so upside down. It's so upside down. The Rebbe teaches us little children can be inspired to do the right thing because they want to do the right thing. And of course, we like to say it's a revolution in Chinuch. The Rebbe changed Chinuch. Bottom line is we got to deliver it. And deliver it means that we have to believe that when you speak to a child about serving Hashem, and that the only reason to serve Hashem is to serve Hashem, the child should appreciate that. But the child can't possibly appreciate that if we don't believe it. And this is a very deep aspect of a Chassidishe chinuch, and it always was. It always was. The Rebbe used this story as a cornerstone to underscore this idea that very little children are very happy to serve the Eibishter just for the sake of serving the Eibishter. And again, the challenge remains the same. What we see with such a great measure of success when our kids are very little has to continue at whatever age they happen to be.